In first place, it's Halflight, Spear of the Church. Nah, just kidding, he's trash. Welcome to my ranking of Dark Souls 3 bosses. Hopefully, if you're clicking on this, you're aware that some bosses are going to be criticized, and I welcome disagreement in the comments, but I do insist on civility and kindness in this amazing little community that we've formed here over the last few months. Now, let's quickly run through the criteria. Counting past 10 makes my eyes glaze over, so there's going to be precisely nothing objective or formulaic about this. Put simply, I've asked myself if I enjoy the fight. For me, what makes a good fight includes engaging, snappy mechanics that keep me moving in patterned or choreographed ways. I prefer this over, on the other hand, such Byzantine complexity that the fight veers into pure chaos, and, on the other hand, easiness to a degree that is inimical to staying engaged. Furthermore, ambiance matters a lot to me. Music can really elevate the artistry of a fight, and so can the arena. Bullshit mechanics will also not knock things down a peg. One of the things I like the most about Dark Souls 3 is that, for the most part, with some notable exceptions, even its low-tier bosses aren't offensively bad, just less rewarding or fulfilling than its top-tier ones. However, there are a few special standouts distinguished by their poor design or pointless tedium. I polled you guys about whether you prefer numerical or tier rankings, and tier rankings had the edge with a very scientifically significant sample size. To keep things from being all negative at the beginning and all positive at the end, I've decided to tackle them roughly in the order of when you face the bosses in the game. Kicking things off is Iudex Gundyr. Dark Souls 3 tutorial boss, you encounter him almost immediately. As a teacher, he excels. If you're new to the series as I was, the initial encounter is shocking. Right away, you realize that this genre is totally unique. His jerking, awkward body motions and combination of delayed and rapid attacks create an impenetrable fog, and I died almost immediately. He's perfectly designed in such a way that each time you face him, however, you learn a bit more. He acclimates you to the pacing and evasion of humanoid enemies. Brilliantly, they have him phase transform into a beast-type enemy, giving you equal exposure to that form as well. His difficulty level is nicely balanced, inuring you to the core philosophy of Soulsborne games that death is an inexorable part of the learning process. And at the end of the day, he is just plain fun to fight. The first proper boss you encounter is Vordt of the Boreal Valley. I like Vordt. I don't love him, but I like him. His cutscene is pretty cool and creepy. As I mentioned in another video, he's a boss who doesn't really require a deep knowledge of any kind of idiosyncratic moveset. You can figure out pretty quickly that one strategy for dealing with chunky boys is to stick to that voluptuous booty. But it's not that simple. You need to know a few attacks, especially his charge attack in Phase 2. He's a good foot wetter. You can spam roll him for most of it, but not for 100% of it. Nicely tuned for an early game boss, in my opinion. And then dropping quickly to the bottom rung here, it's the curse-rotted Greatwood. Is this fight hard? No, but it is mechanically and aesthetically offensive to me. Larding the arena full of reused enemy assets is quite literally the laziest way of tacking on difficulty to a boss when its own moveset fails to do so. When I was a kid, when a teacher was hungover or just really phoning it in, they'd wheel in a TV strapped to a cart with bungee cords and play a movie, and this fight has the exact same energy. Once you get past these nuisances, are you rewarded with an interesting fight though? Nope. You get to hit its ball sacks, dodge its butt slams, and run away when it decides to cover the arena with poison. Outside of random enemy spamming, a boss surrounding itself with a giant no-go zone is the most synthetic way of manufacturing difficulty where none really exists. All in all, the curse-rotted Greatwood isn't dreadful, but on nearly every count, it fails to live up to the standards FromSoft has set for itself, ones that make the games rewarding. So it gets an easy last place tier in my book. The next boss you'll encounter will be the Crystal Sage, your first proper introduction to magic-dealing bosses. With the Crystal Sage, we're finally getting into the territory of bosses that actually test genuine skills. I mean, not in a fun way, but it at least requires more than ambient cognition. The fight tests or teaches two motifs common to FromSoft bosses. One is to identify ways to minimize arena-wide attacks through deduction. Here, since there's one boss who summons multiple enemies that spam you with attacks, it's reasonable to infer that attacking the boss may eliminate the summoned enemies. If you make haste and learn the spawning approach, you can actually stop the Sage from summoning at all. A second approach is to use the environment, relying on pillars and walls to block attacks. All told, it's not a particularly hard fight, and I certainly don't look forward to it, but maybe for a new player, it's edifying in at least some ways. The Deacons of the Derp. The Deacons of the Deep are a study in mediocrity. I don't dread this fight, but neither do I look forward to it. The gist of the fight is that the health bar is affiliated with a floating ball that moves periodically from deacon to deacon. In the second phase, it stays with the main guy surrounded by beefy guards, some capable of healing the boss. It's not particularly difficult, more of a nuisance than anything else. There's just something ineffably goofy about the whole thing. They're clearly supposed to look like macabre and creepy, but in reality, they're actually kind of cute in an ugly way, like little pugs. I mean, look at this little guy. With the Abyss Watchers, we're finally getting into genuine artistry. I have a whole video analyzing them, so check that out, but in brief, this is a gank fight that actually works well. The atmosphere is eerie and funereal, and the fluidity of their movement is poetry in motion. This boss forces you into a sort of slick dynamism as he exists in a state of constant forward motion. Of course, you can just wail on him, but if you respond in kind, you can weave and slide with him. The Farron Greatsword weapon art allows him to sweep around parallel to the floor, a really unique motion that's quite disarming the first time you encounter it. Phase 2 is mechanically genius for the way that it takes the moveset of Phase 1 and transforms it with the addition of fire. This creates the cognitive echo of a sort of faint recognition while still requiring you to learn new strategies to deal with it. Phase 2 on my first playthrough was one of those peak Souls moments when, on initial encounter, reading him felt like an insuperable challenge, but with each repeated attempt, his patterns became more and more legible. He's not much of a challenge these days, but I still find him a ton of fun, the true test of a boss who can stand the test of time. A-grade work here. The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. There's also a very choice thy cup runneth over joke skulking around in here, but I think one biblical allusion is enough. Going from the Abyss Watchers to Wolnir is like eating a perfectly cooked ribeye and then being immediately punched in the dick. Wolnir sucks. I could call this a study in missed potential, but really, what's the potential? A giant skeleton who barely moves. The design is uninspired. He's just a bigger version of the Dark Souls filler enemy, little skeletons. Is there anyone who plays a Souls game and says, you know what this game really needs? More skeletons. His intrinsic elements are laughably easy, so they had to contrive artificial ways to make him more difficult. I like to call this extrinsic difficulty. Intrinsic difficulty is a boss having a complicated or punishing moveset, but extrinsic difficulty is the boss being easy, but throwing up a bunch of bullshit to compensate for that. The classic extrinsic difficulty hallmarks are random enemy spawns and enshrouding status buildup mists, and this guy has both. Incidentally, the Greatwood does the exact same thing, and it's no better here than it was there. This game can really give you vertigo because we're slaloming right back to the A tier with Pontiff. I also have a whole video about him, but man has my opinion about him changed over time. I thought he was downright broken when I first played, but he's designed to punish shitty playing and especially spam rolling. His combos are relentless and arrhythmic, and he's capable of closing considerable distances. This is a boss that's designed to spur you to think more deliberately and strategically. When you do so, there are a number of ways to deal with him and a number of lessons he teaches. His combos, while long, can be learned, requiring you to be more thoughtful about your response timing. He prompts you to utilize positioning, as doing so can put you outside the hitbox of certain moves and prohibit him from using certain otherwise undodgeable jabs. You can parry him if that's your jam, which makes everything a lot easier. The one thing that keeps him out of S tier for me is that in Phase 2, he can obscure his clone with his body, especially when they do the instant forward jab. I find it very, very hard to telegraph. If they kept the clone next to him instead of on top of him, I think that would still be plenty difficult, but a bit fairer. Other than that, though, I absolutely adore Pontiff Sulyvahn. Easy A. I struggled a lot with where to put Aldrich. To me, he's just okay. I guess my bottom line test of a great boss is just whether or not I look forward to fighting them after a billion playthroughs. And I honestly can't say that I look forward to fighting Aldrich, but I don't dread it either. So B tier feels about right. The music is eerie in a sort of futuristic alien way, which fits the overall aesthetics nicely. The arena is a great callback, of course, as is the way he incorporates the moves of the various gods he's either consumed or perhaps dreamt of, depending on how you read the lore. In fact, I think of him really as shining the most as a lore boss. The fight itself is fine. The biggest challenge is the barrage of homing arrows. Now, in his first phase, the volley hardly tracks you at all, and it's pretty easy to outstep. But in the second phase, it tracks you with unflagging tenacity and an obnoxious duration. I mean, it's so bananas that it's actually kind of fun. You have to outrun this endless pursuit while dodging the constant effusion of magic spamming. It's a fight that certainly keeps you on your toes, so he's above average for me. I feel like people kind of sleep on Old Demon King. It's a pretty solid boss. He's definitely above Aldrich for me, but I can't in good conscience call him an A tier boss, so he gets to cohabitate with his less remarkable compatriots. The arena works well here aesthetically and spatially. The column in the middle is good for evasion, his attacks aren't terribly difficult, and their repertoire is relatively limited, but pretty much all of them are good fun. He's one of those bosses whose attacks look intimidating, but on closer inspection are easily evadable, a dichotomy that I always find rewarding. I certainly look forward to fighting him on each playthrough, but because there's no one component that truly leaves me awed, he can't claw his way out of the B tier. Likewise, in the B tier, we have Yhorm the Giant. Yhorm is that classic FromSoft gimmick boss based around a weapon unique and particular to the specific fight in which it's found. For some reason, FromSoft is just pertinaciously committed to putting one of these in their games, and they've gotten better over time. I think there's a pretty widespread consensus that they reached their apex with Rykard, but honestly, I think Yhorm is quite fun. He's a big enemy that works well with the camera, which is far and few between in this game. The animation on the weapon is sick, and his weapon and moveset, while limited, is visually arresting in my opinion. Now, you can also forego the gimmick weapon and fight him regularly, but he has a gargantuan health pool that's certainly meant to discourage this. Nevertheless, it's a good goal for a challenge run. One way to go about this is to shoot for a glass cannon build, as I've done here, so you can deal immense damage. You can bait attacks that cause him to lower his head, where you can deal posture damage to stagger him. Then, make sure you have a build designed to deal high critical damage. Here, I've got Red Tearstone Ring and Morian Blade equipped, both of which massively boost damage when you're below 20% health. On top of that, I have Hornet Ring, which boosts critical attacks, and I use a dagger, which has a critical attack rating of 130 as opposed to the regular 100. And credit to Ongbal for this layout. Certainly for the weapons, I kind of just deduced the things like rings and stuff like that. All told, I think Yhorm is a solid boss, but he's out of the A range because I think he's a bit disappointing as a Lord of Cinder, one of the game's ostensible marquee bosses. Dancer of the Boreal Valley may genuinely have traumatized me on my first playthrough. As I said, DS3 was my first Souls game, and I had barely scraped by up to this point. I think I used summons on Pontiff, so he wasn't the skill check he became the second time I played when I soloed him. But Dancer, holy fuck. I legitimately spent 2 days on this freak. I was beyond frustrated. My body was racked by pure tremulous rage. Dancer is capable of chained attacks Pontiff style, and she deals humongous damage. She telegraphs, but fairly briefly, and it requires a trained eye. She's called Dancer for a reason. Her moves are fluid and acrobatic, and she flits around with a sort of malevolent grace. As a more skilled player, I've come to absolutely love these mechanical aesthetics. With Dancer, each individual move is learnable and evadable, but her RNG is among the highest in the game, so the difficulty of prediction and the extreme rapidity of response she requires make each new playthrough a nail-biter. This is a very solid boss, well deserving of a spot in the A tier. If this ranking system had an A+ slot, Dragonslayer Armour would definitely be in it. As it is, I'm not quite prepared to call him the best of the best, but man is he close. This fight slaps. He's imposing, he's menacing, he hits hard, he alternates between slow, readable, but deadly axe attacks and lightning-fast shield slams, and his incorporation of elemental damage works perfectly. The arena is a bit cramped for my taste, and I could take it or leave it with the aerial projections. These are very clearly forewarned with sonic cues, so they don't slink into total bullshit as they would without them. However, I don't really think they add anything to the fight, and in my opinion, removing them would only improve the experience. I had an epiphany recently that he's secretly a teacher boss. Knowing that Lothric and Lorien come next, this fight is basically a transposition of and preparation for everything about what's to come. Both bosses hit with heavy weapons that hybridize fast and slow attacks in a very unique way. Both bosses can close large distances quite quickly, and both bosses incorporate projectiles into their second phase. These two bosses are a study in mixed timing, and I think the subtle but unmistakable homology between them is really, really brilliant on FromSoft's part. And here they are, my favorite pair of feeble fellows, the Twin Princes. God, do I love this fight. To me, it is pitch perfect, unadulterated radiance. By far my number one pick for the base game. The Twin Princes are not the most difficult fight, but difficulty isn't the most important metric in my rulebook. FromSoft's best bosses have a rhythm and motility in which you're an active participant, and this dynamic is at its acme in the Twin Princes fight. The teleporting and hybridized attack speeds demand consistent roll responses without ever lulling into monotony. The teleportation is preceded by quick but definitive telegraphs, keeping things snappy and fresh without ever being unfair. The mechanical aesthetics are unmatched, making this giant, hard-hitting monster of a man unable to stand up is just a stroke of imaginative brilliance that I'm in awe that anybody was able to come up with it. The cutscenes are the best in the game, in my opinion. The subtleties of storytelling through body language also represent the best of FromSoft's narrative genius. Lothric's torpid slump and the languid flick of his wrist to cast spells like he's a Tennessee Williams character perfectly capture the depredation not just of his curse, but the linking of the fire itself, a cycle of perpetual stagnation that he understandably wants no part in. As I said in my video on the Twin Princes, the great tragedy of this fight is not simply that we have to force an unjust fate upon two siblings who suffered immensely in their attempt to avoid it, but also that I too refuse to link the fire, making their death as arbitrary as the curse against humanity. And of course, the music. Like, this is in a video game. Hey, do you like hellacious boss runbacks? What about an impossibly cramped arena rife with awkward, obnoxious impediments? Perhaps charge attacks that decimate your health with virtually no telegraphs? Well, Oceiros is the fight for you. I find this fight entirely stupid. There's so little space in this ill-planned arena that the boss himself often gets tangled in the roots. The entire thing is just confusing. There's obviously supposed to be a baby in his hands that they edited out, so that's weird. But then again, watching him pancake a baby into the floor would have been quite distasteful. The whole second phase is absurd. The difficulty here is contrived and unfair in my opinion. You can make any boss hard by just making its entire body a hitbox, and that's what they've done here. Legit, I once touched his toe and lost half of my health. His charge attack is functionally unreactable, and we know this kind of attack can work better because Midir has a very similar charge attack that isn't total bullshit. I don't know if other people would agree with putting him on the bottom tier, but I really dislike this fight, and ultimately, that's the test here. Champion Gundyr is simply dope. A more complicated version of Iudex Gundyr. You know just enough about him to have your expectations gloriously subverted. There's something simple about this fight that just works. He's just a big, beefy dude with a big weapon and indefatigable energy. His kicks and body slams are brutal, but there's such a creative way to add in some body attacks which are seldom used by humanoid enemies. He utilizes mixed timing that lurches between fast and delayed, but the delays never feel excessive. It's just a solid, well-crafted, fun fight. When you travel to the hidden zone of Archdragon Peak, your first quote-unquote boss is Ancient Wyvern. Calling this a puzzle boss is an act of generosity earned by the scale of this game's achievements as a whole. Basically, you zip around a map full of bullshit and do a plunging attack that one-shots it. You can fight it like a regular enemy, but it's so boring it would make onions cry. I wish I could remember whom I should credit this line for, but someone on YouTube said they turned the entire fight into a boss runback, which summarizes this pathetic imitation of a fight perfectly. Fortunately, the next boss you encounter is utterly inspired. Ironically, you have to endure another bullshit dragon fight to really get to him, but once you get through the execrable, inexcusable Canberra tomfoolery of the King of the Storm phase, you fight Nameless King proper, and it is a complete banger. Check out my video on him for fuller thoughts, but this fight tests your ability to take your instincts and turn them on your head. I am not trying to speak for all players, but when I discovered how to beat him, it was in a flash of realization that I'd been thinking about his timing incorrectly. I hear people say constantly that he has like mad delays, but I think the opposite is true. I started consistently schooling him once I forced myself to dodge earlier than my instincts told me. This, in my theory, is because one's initial impulse is to treat his weapon like a sword, imagining sword-sized hitboxes and responding accordingly. But this weapon has a much larger hitbox than a sword, which means that if you time your dodges for a sword's hitbox, you'll actually already be within Nameless King's hitbox when your evasion begins. At least for me, once I started dodging earlier than every fiber of my hand muscles begged me to, I evaded him with ease. He's also got a battery of combos that will hit you if you attempt to interrupt him, so in addition to timing, this fight tests the core Soulsborne adage of don't get greedy. Nameless King checks all the boxes for me, so much so that he's managed to negate the distasteful demerits of the King of the Storm and claim a spot in the S tier. Alright, don't hate me guys, but I do not love the Soul of Cinder. I've tried, I really have. I solicited on opinions on Reddit to convince me that he was great with really an open mind. I really wanted to. 80 people or something gave me reasons why they like Soul of Cinder, but I just can't. He exists in this weird, awkward space where on a regular playthrough, he's probably too easy as a final boss because by that point you have a ton of Estus flasks and high HP, so you can trade hits with him and be fine. On the other hand, he is a true nightmare in a no-hit run or an SL1 run. Typically, this disparity indicates certain mechanical deficiencies, and indeed, he has a number of moves that I think are genuinely unfair, something I would say about almost nothing else in the game. As a character, he falls a little bit flat for me. The idea here, of course, is that he represents all the past linkers of the fire, he represents every kind of player, etc. So he's an amalgamation, a personified concept. But the problem with being a little bit of a lot of things is that you do no one thing with any depth, and he feels like a much less fleshed out character than many of the other main bosses. There are other issues for me as well, but I don't want to dwell too much on the negative. Despite my misgivings, as long as you don't have to worry about taking 0 damage, the fight is a decent time that mixes things up and keeps you on your feet. I like the arena, I like the music, and I like some of his moves, so this is a solid B for me. The main problem with Champion's Gravetender is that it's stupid. It's poorly and lazily designed, and the entire experience is concomitantly obnoxious. You have to kill the Gravetender and his coterie of wolves before a big wolf enters the fray. The Gravetender and wolves are nothing to write home about, but the big wolf is kind of cool, and I enjoy its attack patterns. The design overall is definitely worthy of criticism. It feels almost contemptuously inconsiderate of the player's level of enjoyment. It's the fruitcake of boss design. Just haphazardly scrape a bunch of refuse on the counter into a bowl and mix it all together. You wind up with a bland, ill-matching Frankenstein that lacks any thematic unity. It just seems like they were like, hey, let's put a guy and then, I don't know, a few wolves and then maybe also like a big wolf? It's just a bit lazy, but not terrible on an experiential level, but certainly bottom rung. It's feast or famine in Ariandel, and Sister Friede and Father Ariandel are a banquet. This fight slaps. It's easily my third favorite fight in the entire game. On first playthrough, I think most would agree that she's the hardest fight in the game. She's capable of inflicting prodigious amounts of damage and has an arsenal of complicated moves discharged at flying fast speed. Her 3 phases are different enough to make the fight engaging and heterogeneous, but cohesive enough to make them fit together. Phase 1 scratches my itch for slowly viewing a fight as a flurry of incomprehensible blurred terror to, over time, a clear pattern of strategic engagement. The invisibility is at first impossibly opaque, but as you realize the poof of snow indicates her direction, this threat is neutralized. Her scythe swipes of irregular timing and diameter initially make inward dodging impractical, but then you realize that you will always be outside the hitbox if you dodge towards your left and her right, and then that threat too is neutralized, allowing for continuous engagement. Phase 2 is a perfect duo fight, as Ariandel engages continuously while Friede hangs back, expelling tinctures of ice across the arena. The third phase, though, is truly a thing of glory. She pushes the limits of combat within the Souls framework with her extreme speed, but with enough practice, she is indeed a fundamental Souls boss, offering some of the most technically and visually spectacular moves in the game. The music is also appropriately epic. I have a full video breaking this fight down, so check that out if you'd like. Speaking of duo fights, the Demon Princes also represent a top-notch instantiation of that genre. For the most part, one of the demons hangs back, projecting long-range attacks, while the other attacks more aggressively and immediately. I find the explosive propulsions of poison visually thrilling. Dealing with these two in a no-hit context was an unexpected nightmare due to the high potential for taking periodic chip damage, but in a regular fight, it works great. Phase 2 is excellent as well. The demon has a varied moveset that's complex without being completely unmanageable, which is a crucial balance given that he's the third enemy you have to confront without rest or replenishment. I wouldn't call this God tier, but its spot in the A tier is well deserved. Given that the last two dragons you've encountered were the Ancient Wyvern and the King of the Storm's mount, you could be forgiven for having some trepidation as you take the literal plunge into this fight. But a broken clock is right twice a day, and somehow the stars aligned and FromSoft pulled off a god tier dragon. Midir is incredible. The purple coloring and the fantastic texturing on his face and body look impressive graphically even 8 years later. I don't love not being able to lock on, that's a personal preference, but it works in this context. I always love when the mechanics lend themselves to a mixed approach, and Midir is best handled through a combination of rolling and strafing. Some of his claw moves can be evaded simply by walking forward, which just feels so badass as you do it. His charge attack is ever so slightly telegraphed, just enough for it to be fair. His laser attacks and abyss explosions are visually stunning, and he in general just looks genuinely ferocious and terrifying. I go back and forth between whether I like Midir or Placidusax more, but the difference really is trivial. At the end of the day, Midir is one of the best dragon fights ever crafted, a true triumph of video game design. So far, the Ring City DLC bosses have been great, but don't you go feeling good about yourself, Halflight Spear of the Church. You suck. In contradistinction to Tree Balls, Half-Life hasn't outsourced his mechanical difficulty. Instead, he has it in spades to an extent that's unfair, obnoxious, and unfun. It's a PvP fight with NPCs, except it's worse than that because Half-Light isn't bound by the rules of PvP dynamics. He has basically infinite stamina and infinite FP, which he uses to spam roll and use the weapon art of Midir's sword. How the fuck does he have Midir's sword? We need his soul to get it. I just don't get it. It's weird. Of all the weapons to give this guy, it's a strange choice. The only good thing I can say about Halflight is that the unbelievable tedium makes this boss, who comes after him, who we're about to talk about, all the more transcendent. Last, but holy hell, certainly not least, we have Slave Knight Gael. It's hard to adequately put into words what makes this fight so magnificent. In some sense, it defies words since the whole is much greater than its parts. I can point to individual components that contribute to its preeminence among the bosses in this game, and I have done that in my video on Gael, but you really just have to soak up the experience to really get it. The lore is incredible, the arena is incredible. It's the end of time, you're the only two left, poised to show down for the final duel. The music in Phase 1 complements the lore here. It's somber and funereal. All Gael has done is try to find a new home free of the meddlesome, capricious interventions of predatory gods. But the weight of that task has driven him to madness, and it's our job to put him down. It's got intense Old Yeller vibes. The only saving grace here is that, based on clues throughout the DLC and on logic, Gael needs us to do this. We have to carry back the blood of the Dark Soul for him. Each subsequent phase picks up the tempo while artfully incorporating core mechanics from the previous phase. Gael's big hitboxes require fairly skillful dodging, but not to an onerous degree, which is a fair compromise given the length of the fight, his enormous health bar, and the freight truck impact of his attacks. There's something incredibly pleasing about the bobbing and weaving the two of you do in this elegiac tango. The third phase is where this fight becomes true poetry in motion. It's organized chaos, with projectiles vaulting across the sky and pillars of lightning piercing the arena. The dance here reaches its climax, and the music is beautiful beyond words. It's unbelievable that this is in a video game. At the end of the day, I could fight Slave Knight Gael a million times and love it just as much each time. He's magnificent, and he by far is my favorite boss in the game. So that's my ranking of Dark Souls 3 bosses. I'm in no way qualified to do this, so if you watched it through, I really appreciate you listening to my thoughts. And please comment below about your favorite bosses.